This is the day after Donald Trump's acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention, and he made a lot of expensive promises that depend a lot on, well, I mean, all of it depends extensively on his ability to, and others' ability to massively increase economic growth. And of course, we've been predicting that from the beginning. But even with that, which we'll deal with next week, we need to do way more than that. And let's uh, let's look at one aspect of that, namely how many other countries are on the fiscal cliff that we're going to be competing with for the limited amount of loanable funds.
Yeah, I think the scary part of this campaigning is the absence of any discussion of deficits and how we can eliminate deficits and stabilize debt. There's virtually no discussion at all. Essentially, they have spending programs and they know what they want to spend money on, but nobody is talking about sort of fiscal discipline and trying to get back on track in terms of eliminating deficits and getting a stable debt level. But what threats do you see? I know you've looked at some of the data on interest rates and things like that. What other threats do you see in terms of the pushing us over the fiscal cliff?
Well, yeah, I mean that's seemingly the big one. I mean, even without that, the scholarly community that we're a part of is predicting higher interest rates. And now on top of that, we see that countries like UK, Italy, Greece still, or again, Portugal, Spain, on and on. It seems like almost everybody is also in deep fiscal doo-doo like we are. And so they're going to be competing with us for loanable funds. And in addition to that, as these countries do compete for the limited loanable funds, it looks more and more likely that some of them will be at risk for default and or hyperinflation with printing money to get out of it, and that'll further boost interest rates.
Yeah, I think that there's an overly optimistic outlook, especially in this country. I think everybody's talking about a soft landing that somehow we'll be able to restore low inflation and low unemployment and high economic growth. But we certainly aren't there. And I would put my money on a hard landing, and that is, I think that with regard to inflation, uh, it's now, I think, closer to 3%. I think they're going to find it very difficult to get inflation down to the 2% range or so. And even while unemployment is low, I think that the problem there I see is that we have a lot of people who dropped out of the labor force. So uh, we don't seem to be pursuing policies that would bring these people back into the labor force. And as far as economic growth, I mean, 1% is really unacceptable. Now they're saying it's going to bump up to 1.5%, but we're far below the 2% plus range that we think is the optimum range for economic growth. So I think that over the next few years, we're more likely to see a hard landing where we're back in the 1970s with stagflation.
Yeah, I think that's right. We have a plan at IOPA, the Institute for Objective Policy Assessment, to consider and build on, consider some ideas and vet those for what we both regard as the low probability that we're still going to manage a soft landing, which is going to require a cap on spending growth and a lot faster economic growth, which is the solution to everything, according to Donald Trump's speech last night. And it's not enough of a solution. As you say, we're not planning to deal with deficits by cutting spending or finding additional revenues, and we need to do that. Of course, the problem is nobody wants to give the other side ammunition by proposing specific spending cuts. But one thing we could do is we could just revert back, except for defense, which we can't just revert back to something, but we could revert back to the pre-pandemic spending level, and other than defense, and make defense based on the threats. That would be a place to start. That would be something that a politician could propose without being guilty of cutting things. Another possibility is to go back to the founders' conception of the federal government, namely not doing a bunch of things that aren't named in the Constitution, but are just implied according to the Supreme Court. Uh, Again, those are things that could, maybe should be cut, but as you say, nobody's talking about them because that gives the other side ammunition. And with an election coming up, the Federal Reserve is even talking about cutting interest rates, which is, as you say, something that's going to be difficult to do, given that inflation is still outside the bounds that we and they think are acceptable.
Yeah, I think that if you look back at the past 2 decades, basically we've had deficit spending and debt accumulation, and each crisis pushes us closer to that fiscal cliff. And we used to have implicit rules of the game, implicit fiscal rules that, as we've talked about, where, okay, if you have a crisis, you may need to increase deficits and debt, but then traditionally, we attempted to restore a balanced budget and to stabilize debt, but we have not done that for 2 decades. So I think our position is that when we look around at the countries that have had success, like Switzerland, they have basically introduced new fiscal rules that constrain spending constitutionally, because the statutory fiscal rules in place are basically worthless as far as I can see. They just suspend them or circumvent them. So you need something permanent. As we've talked about before, how do you prevent the next Congress from spending our way to a fiscal cliff? And so I think a constitutional fiscal rule is the key to moving fiscal policy from the discretion of congressmen to rules-based fiscal policy, which will prevent them from pursuing these kinds of policy.
Yeah, that's right. That's the prerequisite for doing a lot of things, including we need to generate some additional revenue by various taxes, probably. We're not normally tax raisers here at the Institute for Objective Policy Assessment, but the reality is that's one of the things that might need to be done to generate additional revenue. That was not mentioned in President Trump's speech last night, because, of course, that's not something that you do just before an election, is to promise to raise folks' taxes. Now, all of that being said, there is a chance still at that soft landing, capping spending growth as the Swiss have done and others, and then budgeting again, which means figuring out how to do limited things within a limited amount of money. But as you said, the hard landing seems to be the more likely, because nobody's talking about the things needed for the soft landing. And here at the Institute, again, we do have a proposal, that we're shopping around to process some ideas for that hard landing. One of the hard landing has a silver lining on it. That cloud has a silver lining, and we need to take advantage of getting the federal government back into normal bounds and reestablishing some of these things that worked for a long time. And we need to be ready for that plunge over the fiscal cliff, to manage that, to prioritize in sensible ways what can be cut and how we can find revenue in a frenzy situation, which fortunately we're not in yet. And so we need to take advantage of that to prepare for that crash landing, and also to minimizing costs and seizing the benefits of that lemming-like hurdle that we seem determined to do, to run ourselves off that fiscal cliff, maybe holding hands with the British and the Italians and others that have mentioned in a recent Wall Street Journal article that also seem to be at the edge of the fiscal cliff.
No, I think that Trump's speech was disappointing in the sense that he's basically saying we're going to cut taxes, in the sense that the tax cuts that were supposed to be that were introduced under Trump will be continued. So not only are they not talking about more revenue and whatever tax policies are required to generate more revenue, Trump is essentially locked into this, to these tax cuts. So it's discouraging because I don't know how any rational person can look at that combination of policies and see any end to the deficits and debt that we've accumulated and are projected to incur. So maybe on that dismal note, we should end this discussion. It is the dismal science, right?
Yeah, well, we can bookend today's discussion with this notion of economic growth that we're going to look at in more detail next week. President Trump basically said that's the plan. And as we said, that's not enough of a plan. But yeah, we definitely, among other things, need to massively increase economic growth to manage the debt. Never mind pay for all the promises that President Trump made in last night's speech. And when the Democrats convene in a couple of weeks, they'll make even bigger promises. So with this debt issue, there's debt fatigue, and so that further hinders economic growth. And so we've got a steeper mountain to climb, but there are ways to accelerate economic growth. People can find a discussion of that at the policytalk.org website, and we'll discuss that next week.
Okay, economic growth next week.